Hi, I'm Marilyn Hamilton, and this is another interview from the balcony. And today I'm just delighted to have as my guest Anneloes Smitsman. I've been following her work over many years, and now today I have the delight of having a conversation with her. And before we get started, just let me share some of Anneloes' background. It's so impressive. Dr. Anneloes Smitsman is a visionary scientist. She's an author, a futurist, a system architect, and a leadership catalyst for the transition into a thrivable civilization. She's the founder and CEO of Earthwise Center. She holds a master's degree in law and judicial political sciences and a doctor of sustainability. Her groundbreaking PhD dissertation, Into the Heart of Systems Change, addresses how to diagnose and transform key systemic barriers of our world crisis through a transition plan for a thrivable civilization. Many of you may know Anneloes as the co-author of the Future Humans trilogy with Jean Houston. This book has just been released, and maybe you've seen the first one, The Quest of Rose. Anneloes is also the author of the bestseller Love Letters from Mother Earth, The Promise of a New Beginning. She's also written in many peer-reviewed journals and chapters in books, and she's the architect of Earthwise Tipping Point System, the lead author of our 3.0 Educational Transformation Blueprint, and has been connected with the Seeds Constitution and New Currency. I believe that Anneloes resides in Mauritius, and so with me residing in Findhorn, Scotland, we're almost halfway around the world from each other. So welcome, Anneloes. I'm so happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. And it's such a great joy and honor for me to be with you and to explore all of these important issues together. And actually, I have ancestral roots going to Scotland.
Oh, very good.
Yes, family connections. Yeah, I grew up in the Netherlands. I was born there. And if we're looking at our ancestry and our DNA, there's a lot there from Scottish heritage. Yes, and all the way up in the Nordic countries. So it's fascinating.
Wonderful. Yes. Oh, that's always so fascinating these days to look at our ancestors. Because as you, as a futurist, know that they live in us as well as we lived in them.
That's it.
So
exactly.
Yeah. So, Anneloes, I was really interested and impressed with your R3.0 educational blueprint. And I actually set an intention for Integral City Meshworks for 2021, that what we do is that we explore schooling for a planet of integral cities. And so I thought, wow, this is really an opportunity for us to have a conversation about education and schooling and learning in ways that I think fascinate both of us.
That's it.
So you asked me to share a little bit about integral cities before we get started. And then you created out of this set of blueprints some recommendations, and I was going to ask you to think about them in terms of an integral city. So an integral city I think of as a way of looking at the most complex human system, that's what I call the city, as a living whole system that we can appreciate through complex adaptive systems. So I think of cities in terms of human systems that contain individuals, leaders, teams, organizations, sectors, communities. I worked in all of those human systems before I was called to look at the city, and I realized, oh, a city contains all of those and in itself is a whole. And so I like to appreciate that I think the human system of the city is visible from space. We can't really see nations. And unless you're using some of those photography these days, you can't see individuals easily, but you can see the lights of the cities from space. So they are both an energetic pattern that I believe shows us how complex a city is. I've explored cities through those kinds of lenses for several decades now. And when I started, it was very new. No one wanted to think about cities from the perspective of living systems and people. It was mostly bricks and mortar and transportation systems and all the things that usually urban planners look at from a material perspective. When I discovered the integral model, working originally with Ken Wilber and then Spiral Dynamics and then Ervin Laszlo, I'm a multi-lineage integralist. So I was thinking that by looking at the city as a whole, we could also appreciate the living qualities of people. And I discovered also that biomimicry can help me to reimagine the city. So I borrowed from learning from Howard Bloom, who had written about his understanding of thinking about the city as like a hive, like a beehive. And he recognized that he was seeing patterns in human interactions. So I started to see the city not only through behaviors and infrastructures and systems, but then I opened up to consciousness and culture. And that's how I had started to use the integral model with the 4 quadrants. But then I realized by using these living system roles of citizens and civic managers, business innovators, and the third sector or civil society, we could also look at the whole city through how we interact together as a whole. Now, this is also interesting for a lot of people because when I say the city is a human hive, I think, look at a beehive. You can almost put your arms around a beehive. Not too many people have courage to do that, but it's a way of being able to hold the wholeness of a city so that we could see these new sciences giving us characteristics of the city that are really living in us. So I could go on, and I've got a website, multiple books, and but I think that maybe gives us the basis for why I was so curious about your work as a futurist, as somebody thinking about education, as being willing to put your frames into blueprints. And I love the name of your organization, Earthwise. So I think maybe I will just finish my little description by saying that I've also been impressed and influenced very much by James Lovelock, who said Earth itself is a living system. And so I thought, if Earth is a living system, then it makes perfect sense that cities are living. And he called humans Gaia's reflective organs. I think cities are the organs, or organizations are the organelles, and individuals are the cells. So that's sort of my big picture, small picture, and very dynamic picture of the city. Does that make any sense to you, Anneloes?
Oh, complete resonance. And I love it. I love it because it's like you are a futurist of the collective consciousness experiments in many ways. Yeah? And that is, we're looking at the deeper patterns also, even mythologically, the new mythos, the new story. What are these new future patterns? Then we're seeing it's all about a new form of a collective that is emerging from a healthy complexity, not a degenerative complexity. So what I'm hearing from you is actually by this approach of a city as a collective consciousness information, it could actually provide also the structural support for a whole new way of humanity to be that collective consciousness in a way that's rooted in indigenous understanding, but now also includes, the modern ways, the liquid democracies, the new experiments that are happening in economics as well. So I think this is very, very powerful. And also when I'm listening to you, there's a couple of things that come to my mind. One is in my Into the Heart of Systems Change in the PhD research, a key element was evolutionary coherence. And you may know that, of course, also from the work from Jude Carfin, which she worked on so beautifully as well, to see the evolutionary process as a process of increasing complexity and deepening evolutionary coherence. Now, in the research that I've been working on is that if evolutionary coherence drops below a certain threshold, then the collective consciousness that is there starts to become destructive towards itself and others. So you see this degenerative pattern, increased conflict, increased divisions, disunity, and even suicidal tendencies. It's like it starts to eat itself up and attack itself as almost an immune system disorder. Traditionally in indigenous communities, although they would not use that word, but they would have ceremonies and song and ways of coming together in order to help restore that evolutionary coherence, and using that also at key places, sacred sites around the earth, where there are ways of tapping into the coherence of Gaia herself, and then to be able to enact that and to be able to amplify that then in the environments. And so what we're seeing, if we're looking now at kind of the healthy city patterns, Thriveability, regenerative city patterns, and unhealthy, we could also start to look at that from the perspective of what's happening in terms of the evolutionary coherence of all the various collectives that are together and are brought together. And then if we then know that if the evolutionary coherence is strengthened, that we see natural, spontaneous cooperation, we see deeper collaboration always in ways that is emergent and not imposed, I think then we would probably have the key towards this new democratization that is so essential right now, and including, of course, the greening of the city. But that's when we may also get closer to the noosphere, this omega point, right? That Terre de Chardin was envisioning of the point in when the global consciousness can become conscious of itself within the human experiment. So then cities by design, from that understanding of consciousness, where we're moving towards this new understanding also of the emergent collective, I think it is one of the most important things right now. And especially when we are moving into times of more crisis and greater challenges, my sense is that where we'll see either a breakdown or breakthrough would be exactly those points as which cities have become aware of themselves in that new light, have practiced in really proactive ways what it means as a collective to respond with challenges, have a story as well that people can relate with, can feel in their hearts, that is also bioregionally anchored. So it's not just about the old nation state cities, but the cities of Gaia. And these can be lifelines. I really feel that this work that you're doing and what you're describing is incredibly important for where we're at now and where we need to be going.
No, thank you for all those observations. They really resonate with me. You know, the couple more things I could share about my appreciation of the collective in the city, that I certainly originally thought if we're going to have new governance, if we're going to have collective consciousness, it's more likely going to happen where most of us are living. So in the developed world, 90% of humans live in cities. Even in the developing world, it's more than 50% now. So I think that Gaia actually has a purpose for the cities that have emerged. Most of us do not know what that purpose is. We're in the process of discovering it. It's an evolutionary path for us. But one of the things that I've discerned as you're seeing the evolutionary, I would call it a holarchy, I've created what I call the master code of care, caring for self, so that we can care for each other, and together we care for our places, our bioregions and ecoregions, and all together then we care for the planet. So caring for self, others, place, and planet is a nested set of its coherence. And I've always thought in the last while, as our great incoherence and fragmentation that's been happening in the world, that it is the cities who've brought together all the cultures. Most of our major cities have multiple cultures, if not all the cultures of the world, living together. And it's there we're going to have to figure out how to do it so that we not only survive, but as you call us, to thrive. So,
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for your encouragement that my calling to look at the city has some contribution to make into
Oh,
collective
amazing.
consciousness. Yeah.
Amazing. Yes.
So, Anneloes, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your R 3.0. And when I was looking at, I have not had the chance to read all of the documents, but some of them, I came across your 13 recommendations that came out of that. And I thought that might be a good way to explore from your perspective, because you were looking at broader, I think, frames than cities. How do you see that they would be applied in cities? And so if that
Sure,
seems like
we
a
can
good
go
next
there.
point for you, yeah, let's try that.
We can do that. And what I'll share also then very briefly just before going there is this slide first.
Beautiful.
And these are the 7 learning perspectives for regeneration and thrivability, which really forms the integral framework for the blueprint. So the blueprint was designed really in the family of blueprints of R 3.0, which is an organization based in Europe, who's really been kind of leading the way for what is then a regenerative and design for the new economics, the new governance that's also resilient, is transformative. And they've been focusing very much also on what's the context that needs to be provided for making those deep transformational changes. Because one of our main critiques was that sustainability hasn't been context-based most of the time, because people were not looking at thresholds and allocation, and therefore to also seeing what is a fair share and how do you distribute both the responsibilities as well as the opportunities, the costs as well as the value that's generated in the system. So they asked me then to be the lead author for the educational transformation blueprint. And initially we started that off as a kind of critical look at, what's not working within education. How is education part of the problem of our sustainability crisis? But then along the way, I asked them, can we take a slightly different approach? Because I think we have so many blueprints out there about what's not working. I think we need to now start inspiring people, and actually that through the process of reading ourselves, that our consciousness starts to go into this regenerative mode. So that by us becoming regenerative in our perspectives, in our understanding, in the questions that we're asking, that the transformation that we are seeking starts through that process. So it's out of that I then framed the 7 learning perspectives that we can apply to ourselves. We can apply that with our family, our relationships, our communities, our cities, the organizational cultures that we form part of, really at all the different scales. So the 13 recommendations then are a summary really of everything that's been explored through these 7 perspectives. And each of these 7 perspectives, we've explored that through 3 key areas, because I really felt, again, that giving context is really important. For example, if we are working with students learning as a context, then what is the context principles that we are giving for deciding what do we need to learn, how are we learning this, also how are we measuring what we think is learning and development, what is the feedback that we're creating. So chapter 1 then, for example, has 3 contextual explorations, and one is the Anthropocene to better understand sustainability as context. The other one is the noosphere to also give hope and direction. That the Anthropocene, for example, if we only focus on that, it may become quite hard for younger generations to take in, because they may feel we are a very destructive species. What can I contribute to the solutions, or do I even have a future? Whereas the noosphere then gives that perspective that there is also an emerging learning global consciousness, and that we as humans have a role also in how consciousness is evolving. And then bringing in the new Renaissance as a context principle shows then that in order to make the jump to the next stage of our evolutionary development, it requires a rebirth. And then what we're seeing is that this rebirthing and this Renaissance impulse is already happening. So just the climate crisis in itself, for example, the COVID crisis within itself, the dying and the collapse and the pressures of change are creating Renaissance conditions. And that's so important for younger people to understand, therefore, that this transformational process is a metamorphic process that requires also the definite dissolution of old ways and emergence of new ways. So just wanted to give that quickly as a context for people who are working with the blueprint. And there are a lot of exercises and a lot of questions and practices that you can go through and to really then start to see what am I starting to notice differently, or what's emerging in my own life, or what are the synergies that are kind of happening as a result. So then also what we've explored, and is especially beautiful for children, is to saying, well, let's have a new paradigm understanding of life as a unified reality, and not this mechanistic view as if life, consciousness, and the universe it consists of separate parts and particles held together by mechanical laws, but to really see the prior unity of life and therefore also consciousness as foundational, and matter itself even as an expression of consciousness, and letting go of that old duality, therefore, between mind and matter. So we explore also then what are, for example, then the 13 qualities of life that are within us, but then also again in the cities. So if we now link that again to cities, would be really, really beautiful. And I'm sure that in regenerative cities, we would see this as well, is that these qualities are by design emphasized. It can be in the art that there is, it can be in the storytelling, it can be in the music, and that we could even diagnose the health of cities by saying, is it healing? Is that city healing? Do we have an expression of wisdom? How much is that felt sense of unity? How's the community doing? What's happening in the relationship? So these are all these different qualities that we also then work with for children themselves, first of all, but of course for all of us to realize this is all part of life. And then knowing that, how do we then apply that? And it's through that we go through that process then of learning for regeneration and thrivability as both new ways of learning, but also new ways for engaging learning. And so for the city, then what's really beautiful is to look at that from a way of how does a city learn? How does a city learn about itself from itself? And but also then how does the roots of one city, just like the mycelial network, connect with the roots of other cities? And how does that start to inform then for people also a sense of their future? And we also work in that on governance of agency for regeneration and thrivability, which I think is really critical, again, for cities as well. And what are these new governance models? There's a lot of movements out there that are experimenting with decentralized or distributed, what they sometimes call forms of governance. But what are also the kind of tools and the technologies, and part of this network indeed seeds and a network platform called Hi-Fi, who's been developing these tools like DHOs for people to be able to self-organize and to be able to also create new tokens, regenerative currencies, and ways for people to collaborate with greater ease and share also the resources. So also the governance of agency itself. So if you go that, not only do people have agency, but what's the agency of a city now as a living organism? And how do we empower that? And that brings me then as the context now for these 13 recommendations.
Thank you for setting the context. I really believe that that's really important. And you have such a vibrant way of presenting that. When I was writing my first book and I'm looking at the intelligences of the human hive, the first set of intelligences were all about context. So this is so really resonant and generative for me. So thank you, Anneloes. So you, I think, have turned the number 13 from unlucky into lucky. What are the recommendations that you've come up with?
That is so true. Yes, I felt that when you see the movement of the patriarchal, it's almost like we try to suppress the 13, whereas in indigenous cultures, 13 is a number of transformation and integration.
How beautiful.
And even if we take, the spoke of the wheel with its 12 points, if we even take it as a compass, it cannot integrate unless there is the 13th in the center. So, and this is also where, even with integral theory, where often people talk, of course, always about the quadrant, and I always say, but don't forget the 5th, because if you don't have the center point, the quadrants cannot converge. And if they can't converge in an evolutionary space that is the center, then there cannot be the emergence of the new birth that comes out of that integration. So hence that's
a great point, because when I draw, I have 5 maps of the integral city, and they're always pivoting around the evolutionary impulse at the center. So and even
that's the 5th point.
Even when I talk about the 4 voices of the city, I always say it's 4 plus 1. And the plus 1 is the other human hives in the bioregion, but also each city has at the center the purpose that it's really there for, that we're still trying to articulate. So I think we're really discovering a lot of resonance between our approaches. I'm not surprised, because you're coming so totally from the science and the spirituality of living systems. So thank you. So what about these 13 recommendations?
Yes. Okay. Now, number 1, and that's just so essential, is listen to the feedback of life and our planet. So if we're looking, of course, at our crisis, we can see we're not. And when I'm saying listening, I mean more than hearing or knowing. So listening really means I've heard it, I've received it, and I'm responding appropriately. So in everywhere we were seeing that what's the feedback that life is giving us and our planet is saying, slow down, don't go over these really essential boundaries. Please realize life is interdependent, and start to bring the human back within its evolutionary context as a family, as a member of a family of life, with many other life forms. So also, if we don't listen, there's no learning. So that really, really is the first step. And it's also understanding that everything that we are doing, every action, even say intention, creates information in the fields of life that are shared by not just ecosystems or the people, but also shared by the very collective consciousness that we're talking about. And it's so important that we develop the sensors and sensing capacities to know then from what we are initiating, what's coming back. Because if we don't close that loop, if we don't capture, even just within ourselves and within our own awareness, how life responds to us, then we are missing the most fundamental principle of our interdependence. Because life responds to us, but if we're not kind of bringing that back in that relationship, bringing it full circle, saying, okay, Gaia, I'm hearing you. Okay, life, yes, I remember now, put out that intention, I did take that action, and what's that steering? The person who lives their life like that consistently learns in a totally different way. And for such a person, the system is a living consciousness. It is not an ID. It's a living reality.
It's not just academic. It's not just intellectual. It's
exactly
total sense of life and being.
Total sense of That's it. And now, of course, if we want to take this into governance and we want to take this into economics, then it also means that when we're looking at what we identify as progress or even development, what are we measuring? What are our indicators? Does it include these critical planetary as well as social threshold boundaries? Does it include indicators for well-being? Does it include indicators for this evolutionary coherence we talked about before and fluctuations? Does it include indicators for measuring the health of a city and its thrivability? So thrivability has the word thrive and ability, and implies two things. Namely, one is the potential to thrive, which is kind of given and systemic, and the other one is then the capacity to make use of that potential and for that to become a living reality again that is continuous. So all of this is also part of listening to the feedback of life on our planet. We need to make this visible within our governance and within our economic systems, but also within our educational systems. And right now, we have created human systems for governance, economics, and education that is very arbitrary, very, very artificial, because there's many informational loops that have no place in it. Even in our legal systems, we don't have natural laws. It's all still based on a very human-centric idea that started around the protection of, our rights. And property, nature as property. Yeah. So it seems such a simple principle, but when we really start to apply that and test our human systems to this principle, then we start to suddenly see the need for some massive transformations and redesign. And that brings us then naturally to the second, addressing systemic thriveability barriers. In my PhD research, I made a distinction between barriers and boundaries. Because when I was asking the question, why is it that we know what's wrong, we know what doesn't work, and we so stubbornly as a species continuing towards collapse? So knowledge of the problem is obviously not enough. And I started to kind of ask these questions in various systems, educational institutions, in private sectors. And I noticed then that many people felt a sense of entrapment that they couldn't put their finger on. So they'd say, I feel like if I start developing myself, I may lose my job because then my ideas become too different, or I don't feel alive, life health balance with my work. I feel that everything is around productivity, and or do you feel like the goals of the system feel imposed? I don't feel that I fundamentally can have a direction in the say of what's really happening, and the creation of the future, even to the most basic levels of where it concerns my family. So what I noticed through that is that mechanistic systems, because they impose goals, they polarize the diversity in living systems, including ourselves, and because they drive a very competitive idea of growth through exponential extractive growth, where you get this very dangerous curve. Yeah. Therefore, mechanistic systems, because it harms the interdependencies of living systems, they create thrivability barriers. And therefore they harm the systemic boundaries. But most of our sustainability conversations are around the management of the boundaries, and we focus on the boundaries as the issue, but the boundary issues are only there because we are not seeing and making visible what the barrier issues are. So unless we shift and transform fundamentally the archetypes of growth and development that very often remain invisible for people, but are felt in their experience, unless we make that visible, put it out in conversation, create a language around that for people, it's very difficult to progress to even the next steps. And in the case studies where I've been doing this work with people, what you then notice is when they start to map out these systemic barriers within their cultures, organizations, or cities, what happens then is instead of feeling it's because of them, or it's the system's fault, or I can just not be with those other people, that language falls away. Now suddenly they notice, oh, hold on, so there is a polarizing dynamic underneath it that I've been caught in, and perhaps my neighbor as well. So before I start to see my neighbor who has a different religion or different ethnicity as my enemy. Maybe we're all caught in that. And then you start to notice that the barriers are no longer filtering the perception and the relationship and the interaction. Now we start to return to the living systems opportunities and start to then see how to transform these barriers together. So this is really important work for cities and communities, and other ways in which
I really like your discernment between barriers and boundaries, because within an ecology, I would say the boundaries in living systems are both to be respected, and I love your connection with the feedback loops. But when people see mistakenly that boundaries are barriers as opposed to ways of, I think, giving the definition and qualities of a living system and how they interact together in a healthy ecology, and being able to name barriers and then see in the system what I would call, probably, would you say that the barriers would be related to the fragmentation and not being able to see things as a whole? And then when we can reappreciate that we have new lenses to be able to see the life in our system. And I love really that you started with feedback, because I often see in systems that's the last place, and it's either in the middle or the end that I'm always pointing at, and we cannot do this without feedback. So I really like that you start there. And I even imagine maybe you can share something with, when you're a mother of 2 children, do you think that teaching feedback to children in education, not just the education system, but actually in the classroom, is that something that's learnable at a very, very early age?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, some of the background of this, my father, he's retired now, but he was a professor in child development from an ecological perspective from the University of Nijmegen. And so a lot of their research showed that in the first 2 years of our life, and it starts already in the womb, children are natural system sensors. So we are born with the sensory capacities for feedback. Everything is, we're learning only through feedback, and that the feedback that we are receiving, for children, the way they internalize that, whether that is a supportive or it's empowering or it's restrictive and controlling, sets up the learning patterns unconsciously, often, you see, at a very, very early age. And so when I saw through his work, and sometimes we used to be part of the little experiments around that, of how do young children learn when you can't just speak yet, so when you can't verbalize it, and because we can't yet verbalize it, how we're sensing the interaction, the feedback between our caregivers and ourselves, it's almost, we are even more aware of that. And then later, a lot of times when children go into the formal education, it's trained out of them. So that they're saying, stop acting up. No, you're just imagining it, or don't be so difficult, or get over it. So we're telling them to distrust their deep, sensory capacities for what it feels to be part of these different feedbacks.
Beautiful, thank you. So let's see what happens when we look at the context that you talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when we go on facilitating learning as a process of life, which is the 4th point here, is so important for children. So, and we're saying if it's a process of life, it also means that there's honoring their cycles and there's rhythms. And so that's for children, for example, that to understand that if they've been working very hard at an issue, there's moments that you tell them, now let it go and play, do something else, or just go and rest, and let integration take place. Or what we'd say, for example, when I was growing up, I noticed that playing Bach on the piano, playing with my left and my right hand, would greatly help me with mathematics, because just having these different activities and ways of training your own nervous systems and musically, and then I would start to explore the patterns of Bach in numbers, but also in paintings. So also facilitating learning as a process of life means that we are helping children to discover these fractal patterns, and helping them to really see the connective patterns, the deeper unity of life. And what happens when children grow up like that, what I've noticed also with my own children, is that there's a much deeper trust, so they know that, even if it's the difficult times or there are nightmares, they know how to go back to nature, to connect with nature. And it's so fundamental. And I've also noticed how for many children, this is no longer obvious. So when I've come to the schools of my children and we teach these processes, this is a primary school, often children would look at me like, really? You can talk with nature? You can connect with the tree? I can, if I need inspiration, I can go out in the garden,
And what strikes me, that what you're sharing is that through this way of learning, children become aware or sense they're part of nature. It's not out there, it's in here.
Exactly.
So there's not
here.
It's not only fascinating, but I'm part of nature too. Nature's in me.
That's it.
Yeah.
Nature's in me. That's right. And then learning to also heal themselves in nature's way.
Yes. And I know this last year that's been so important for all generations to learn. Is that to get outside and let nature do the healing, that none of our technologies for the pandemic have been effective as nature has been.
Exactly. That's it. And then that brings me then naturally to point 5. So imagining exploring our future potentials. Again, children, because of their sensory capacities from an early age, their imaginative and imaginal capacities we're born with that. But again, if we don't keep practicing that, and then it will be diminished. And we make here a distinction between imaginative and imaginal. So an imaginal is really also an inner realm of consciousness itself, whereby within that there is still a state of possibility. So this is why the imaginal and the future are so close together. You could even say it is the same realm. And because in an imaginal, the imaginal areas within the system allow the system to renew itself. Mm-hmm. And when it renews, it also transforms structurally. And that's a really important point in development, because we're looking at what's the difference between learning and development. Then we're seeing that when development takes place in children, if we go back to children again, then we're seeing also that there is the emergence of new structural coupling. And that before that jump of development, there's often an uncoupling of old patterns and structures and ways to then recouple at a higher level of organization. And that's a developmental jump. But it means there's something within the system that is not prescriptive. This is almost like where the formula or the algorithm breaks down. And why I feel a lot of people are saying is consciousness assimilation. But it might be simulation is part of it, but I believe it's not, because consciousness is essentially not a formula. It is not, it's predetermined. So the imaginal capacity of a system is the capacity of a system to renew itself through the activity of learning, and by so doing to develop into new stances, new structural coupling, which then becomes the affordance and the conditions for the creation of new futures. So the imaginal capacity is what makes this future creative. And that means that the future potentials now, you could see that the future already exists now as information in a state of potentiality that we can access by using our imaginal powers. So when I was applying that, for example, with cities here in Mauritius, I would ask people to go with me on a journey into the future, not thinking about the future, but really close your eyes and imagine a path opening up in front of you. Go through that path, and we arrive now at 2030. And as you arrive now in 2030, take a deep breath, get a sense of how you feel and how's your environment and how is life here now in this reality of 2030, of this more optimal expression of our consciousness. So taking them, through that experiment, really activating and utilizing these imaginal capacities with people who, for some of them, it was the first time they even closed their eyes, while with others, it was completely new. Some of them had never meditated. But what would happen spontaneously is that when people started to share their collective visioning experiences, that they found that they had amazing similarities between their visions and other people's visions. So like a man would say, well, you're describing that mountain, and my forest just ended here in my future experience of my city. But this mountain I could see further on, but I didn't get fully a sense of it. And the woman would, for example, explain what this mountain was doing. So they would create now this connective map of these visions that gave them also, for the first time, for many of them, the experience of a collective consciousness.
Yes, that's what
exactly. So this is such a powerful process. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I love your connections with not only the processes you're talking about, but as you were speaking, I was remembering, if I'm correct, that as the brain develops, it actually myelinates. It actually releases connections it doesn't need. And that's what allows it to emerge and create the structures and be ready for new self-organization to be constantly there. And as you invite us to become aware and even sense the future coming into us, and be courageous enough when you put them in the groups that you're describing, to be able to articulate, this is what I sense is our future. And that, I think, ties well into my intuition that Gaia has a purpose for these collective consciousness, even for the cities, and it's our opportunity to discover what that is. And if we can do it together, then the collective consciousness, the capacity for that, not only emerges, but then I think it can strengthen and grow its own ways of being able to be to thrive, as you're saying, because I think so many people now sort of go collective consciousness, that's too woo-woo, I don't think we can go there. But what I hear you saying is, actually, when we do it together, we all look around the room after we open our eyes and say, we all just went through, we shared an energy trip into the future. So thanks for those stories. Beautiful.
You're welcome. And also when we talk about Gaia, what the purpose for Gaia has for us, one other thing that comes often to me is that, we are all cells on her body, and she's going through massive changes. It's not easy being a planet at this time. Yeah. So imagine being Gaia. You're running a fever. You have all these children that are quarreling with each other and can't seem to agree on much. So if you are going through so much, what you would want is also a sense of peace. So if we as cities become more coherent, there's more energy also available for her to do what she needs to do to heal herself and to balance herself. So I think it's, we forget that sometimes. What does our planet need from us so that our planet can do what she does best? And how can we best support that? And we don't seem to realize sometimes also the impact of our collective consciousness on her.
Yes, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that idea.
So yes, and number 6 is that this is then indeed how we are developing these future creative learning systems. So the city now becomes a future creative learning system, and this is where we go further than just regenerative, because sometimes people hear the word regenerative as regenerative, as in restorative, repairing, which is a really important part. But there's also the birth of new systems. Life is constantly experimenting and evolving. So it's also important that we make space, not just for the but for being generative, not just only regenerative. And that's the future creative. So, and learning and development is holistic, it's integral, it's naturally future creative. And so when that capacity is depressed in either people or organizations or cities, then we see the rise of depression, rise of suicide, rise of division, because people then, they don't feel a sense of future, so they feel blocked. They feel like there's a black hole in front of them. And when we open this up, this is what I've noticed as well. I did this in this practice also with a group of children. They were around 12, 13 years old, but they came from very abused families, a lot of violence, alcoholism. And I asked these teenagers, what is it you want for the future? And one little boy, he looked at me and went, nobody's even ever asked me that. I don't even know how to answer that. Nobody's asked me what I want for the future. So would you like to make a drawing? If you were having truly the freedom and support, what would you want? And he started drawing that. And that very process of asking that question and him having the freedom to express that and explore that started also a healing process. So imagine that our city is asking from us, what as a city, what would you like for the future? How would you like to live here, to grow here? What city would you like to pass on to your children and other people's children? So that very process itself.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And it connects to some of the thinking I've been doing around what the Indigenous invite us to do, is to think about 7 generations from now. And so I love the idea that you invite the child to imagine what city would they like to pass on to their next generation while they're still thinking as a child, because I think they can probably get very close to a real well-being and positive place. I can imagine that they would want to share that with their peers.
They would want to share that. That's right. And often not been asked, because everyone around them is so busy and they always, when asked to do these certain tasks or learn in a certain way, that there's not enough space again for that creativity. And I think that creativity is really also what makes us so human. It's what is the heart of our humanity that we need to keep nurturing. And that then comes into from those processes, and then designing for regeneration and thrivability. It's also designing for these practices, designing for these questions, designing not just for sustainability. You can't create a good marriage with sustainability. You don't sustain your marriage or your relationships with others. You want a thriving relationship. So going further, and then initiating and nurturing what I call these third way approaches. And that is, when we go back again to these systemic barriers, then we see underneath these systemic barriers, as a result of mechanistic archetypes, is a very dualistic conception of life. And dualism in those ways, when it becomes really stifled and very tense, then it becomes also very polarized. So then we really need third way approaches for being able to address that. And that's a big work right now, also I think with cities, also when there's all these new waves of migration. What does integration in a city mean? Some people, they may be afraid, well, does it mean absorption? Is integration absorption? Am I being absorbed into a collective that I will forget my cultural roots or my ethnicity, and my ancestors will just be annihilated in this process? So it can bring up a lot of fears and concerns. Or does it mean, we're going to just agree to disagree, which is not transformative? We're going to, you stand here, I stand there. Don't come any closer, and we're going to coexist, but we're not going to co-learn. So third way approaches to initiate and nurture that is, first of all, making again the tensions and polarization visible in a safe way. And then really the very much the integral approaches that you work with. So to really, for people to understand what's the larger we, and where does this perspective and that perspective come from? Could be actually common roots, and what's the kind of third principle here, so that the third that emerges, it is not an absorption, it's a new approach, it's a new understanding, it's a new perspective, it's not a compromise. Because a lot of people feel like, okay, I can't win this battle. So to get out of the duality, I will just let it go. I won't argue anymore. I will just let my point of view go. Then, no, then we haven't come to a third way ground. Third way only happens when there's truly the emergence of a new understanding, new perspective that's larger than what there was before. So then we're seeing that the collective itself has been growing and developing and evolving. And that requires, and there's number 9, empowering collaborative agency. We can't get there through competitive agency. We need collaborative agency. And yes. And I think that when we come to the governance aspect of cities, there's a huge role in there for being able to invite, to guide, but also to reward collaboration for people who are living there, and also collaboration with nature. So this is empowerment of that. Yeah.
I'm going to tag that for maybe a future conversation. How do we reward collaboration? Because I'm sure that will open up a whole, at least hour of exploration. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because there's so many ways to reward that. And yes, then we, number 10, communicating patterns that connect rather than patterns that connect. What's the media? What stories are communicating? What information is coming around? But bringing it again also back to children, to youth, give them a role in telling, in creating the stories. How can they become the new storytellers of the emerging future in their city that they want to see? It's so important. But also we can use communicate patterns that connect, even if we are evaluating the health of an organization, to start to see what happens in these communicative patterns. Who makes a decision? How is power distributed? Who needs to ask for permission for what? How does it circle around? So communicate patterns that connect and communicate with connective patterns is really, really important also as an evaluative tool for cities to see, are we thrivable and are we regenerative? Because that structure of communication links back to, is a city able to learn and develop as a collective? So what are the collective learning capacities of the city? So it links right back there. Yeah.
And would it link right back up to number 1, to the feedback system?
Yes, the feedback.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. And exactly. I think we've had a lot of experiments over the last year where our usual communication processes and channels have either been shut down or diverted to be completely online. So we're really in I think a stage now where we need both to reconnect person to person, group to group, but also to recalibrate the kinds of media that have emerged so we can sense the feedback loops that we need. Yeah. So I think the communication patterns are really powerful. Yeah.
Really, really powerful. Exactly. And that helps. And also for number 11, acting as a thrivable learning community. You can't do that if you don't have these connective patterns in our communication. So acting, and also the recommendation of acting as a thrivable learning community, is for people to understand this future can be acted on now. So if people are saying, well, if we do A, B, C, then such and such will happen, and then we'll go into being thrivable. No, that is not the right approach. Act as if you're living it now. So act your future, be the future you wish to live in. Be it right now. Act as that. And then when we ask ourselves that question, say that you are having a leadership role or an educating role in your city. If I am now, I am also that consciousness of a thrivable learning community. What as a thrivable learning community would I do differently now? What would I need to change? What do I need to strengthen? What would I need to perhaps let go? So even standing in, taking that place, not just about what does my role and position ask me to do, but what as a thrivable learning community am I required to do right now? will already inform then again the feedback to number one.
Yes,
it
that's
creates
right.
sets of different feedback loop. Yeah.
And I like the as if. That's sort of a process I use on myself when people saying, well, how can you possibly do that? And they say, actually, I'm not sure yet, but I act as if I know. And
exactly.
then it opens up the possibilities. And if more of us do that and compare notes, I think that I see a lot of barriers that have emerged in urban habitats because of the last couple of years. And we need to give ourselves permission to act as if there is well-being, as if we're thriving, and maybe just take the tiniest step forward in the as if, so that it can start to really catalyze us to invite the future in. That's sort of the approach I take. Yeah,
that's it, because then we embody the future, we bring the future into being.
Yeah.
So because these future potentials already, they exist now in a state of potentiality. If we are living that as if it is already here, now we're embodying it. We are living that reality. We are communicating at the deepest level of our being that as a reality. And that also starts to reorganize the informational patterns around us to start to harmonize with that. So it's incredibly important. That's where then also celebrating comes in. So when you celebrate that now also as a rite of passage, we start to acknowledge that it is a reality, that it's not just something that's only aspirational or oh, it would have been, could have been. No woulds, no coulds. Make it celebrated now. And celebrating rites of passage moments also means creating collective moments for the grief. Not only the wonderful feelings that we like so much, but also saying, look, we're going through a huge death right now. There's so many, not just people dying, there are ecosystems dying, plants, animals dying, there are dreams dying, there are intentions dying, there are hopes are dying. So it's so important that we pause also and can grieve together and acknowledge that before we go back into the rush of doing things, and then work with these moments of death, of dissolution, of the letting go now as places for the rebirth. That's what the regenerative renaissance, what we started with earlier, was so important with. And also when there's the emergence of new states, new perspectives, new understanding, a sense of even new identity, that too is celebrated. Because very often when something is just coming out and it's still so young, like a little baby, it needs more care and support, and needs more holding as a community for it to now to really come into being. And these are really, really sensitive, vulnerable little moments where this new emerging life in this new form, if it's not welcomed, its first experience of our own collective here is now not so sure if this is safe, and it may retreat, and it may even never fully come into being. And in indigenous communities, again, the word is rites of passage. By a person may get a new name or a new totemic relationship, and so there's a celebration of the acknowledgement of the shift in that person, and the whole community is growing and is richer for it because this person has now gone through this major rite of passage. And so celebrating this as a city, I think is incredibly important, and may also for a lot of youth who are radicalizing actually really help them, because it may be that they are subconsciously or unconsciously looking for a rite of passage in the old pattern. Yeah? And the old pattern is you go close to death, you go to do something very dangerous, very risky, but they learn there's a new pattern also that's more gentle, in which we can grow and evolve, and we don't have to push everything to the edge of danger.
Yeah, and I'm thinking this sounds a lot like a quest, a rite of passage quest.
That is a quest.
And invite the future in, not only individually but collectively. I'm going to let you finish your 13th comment, and then I want to tell 13, you
that's right.
a little story from Fintorn that might make you smile.
Oh, I love that. So yes, the 13 invests in the future of life in a thriving world. And so we invest, of course, first of all, with our hearts, we invest with our intentions, we invest in where we put our attention, we also invest in terms of where we put our action, our resources, our commitments, our engagement, and as well financially in many other ways. But it's also to broadening this understanding of what do we mean with investment. So from a city perspective, that means also what are we making a priority? What is there space for on the agenda? What are the goals that we are supporting, and what are the goals that may not be aligned with this that we need to say no to? So this investment in the future of life as a future ancestor, realizing we are all future ancestors of these new civilizations that are seeking to be born, is really essential.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful way to complete your set of recommendations. When you were talking about the celebrating the special moments, rites of passage, it reminded me of something that's happened recently this year in Findhorn. We had 2 fires that destroyed our community center and our sanctuary. And of course, as you breathe in, it was really a huge loss for the consciousness and culture of our community, as well as the infrastructure, and totally changed how we could even behave. We couldn't eat together anymore, that sort of thing. And there was a huge brownfield that was left from the fire sites. So over the last number of months, those have been gradually cleared. And there's been an invitation for people to come with the park gardeners on Tuesday mornings and help to replant and reimagine that whole area. So we've gradually watched behind the fences as things have been cleared away. And they said that they were going to leave this part of the area for some wildflowers, and that they were going to just allow grass seed to grow. They weren't going to use turf. They were just going to invite nature to come. So last week I walked by, after I had, when you lay grass seed down for a while, it doesn't look like anything's happening at all. And I saw this little sign, and it had little baby carriages on it. And it said, "Shh, be very quiet. Baby grass is growing and it needs its rest." And by the time I saw the sign, all of a sudden the entire field had gone green, like, whoa. And it was like, oh, it touched me so deeply. And the little sign itself was like a way of both inviting participation in what the intention was there. But when I saw that the grass had grown and all sorts of other plants and flowers had decided to join in the celebration, you could see that nature itself was giving us feedback, and the feedback that the people had given nature, and just this little humorous sign. I just felt, well, that was a great way to celebrate what had meant so much to us in that area. And it gives me hope and expectation of ongoing thrivability, that we've had to let go of some of the things that were central to our place and be open to what else now can come. So I think that's maybe a way to capture.
I love that. Yes, it captures all the 13 points, in fact.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Yes.
Well,
yes.
And thank you. I think your recommendations are beautiful, and I really appreciated how you've expanded on them. And I think we could take each one of them and do another conversation about it. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on the balcony today.
Pleasure.
And I look forward to some more conversations, Anneloes.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.